Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Emily Collins. I am the Membership and Programs Manager with the Connecticut League of Museums. And I want to welcome all of you to this program that we have put together in collaboration with Connecticut Humanities and Creative Commons. The program is Open Access Made Easy, How to Open Your Collections for Greater and Better Sharing. And again, I just want to thank our colleagues at both of those organizations for helping to put this together for our audience. Just a few quick things before I pass it over. This program will be recorded and we will send it out to everybody who's registered afterwards. It'll be available on our YouTube channel, so feel free to share with your colleagues or go back for reference as needed. We will also be sending an email with any additional resources that come out of this presentation. And I will say as well, too, if you have any questions as the presentation is going on, there will be a break in the middle of the presentation. Feel free to raise your hand or pop a question in the chat when the time comes, and we will have some time at the end as well for any questions. So I think that's everything on our end for the housekeeping stuff. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Mike Kamizis at Connecticut Humanities. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Really grateful for the League for hosting us again. For those of you who remember, we had a great series of webinars last year with Creative Commons, and I'm super excited that we're able to continue to talk about rights, open access, copyright, and intellectual property with all of you in the state. So Mike Kamizis, Manager of Partnerships and Projects at Connecticut Humanities. I do a lot of work in digital humanities and digital libraries and digital archives. That's where my background is. And I'm pretty much here to answer the question, why is Connecticut Humanities involved in intellectual property work? So I'll talk for 5 minutes and then we'll get to the main event. So why IP? So we encourage the open sharing for projects and programs created with our grant funding to further our mission of ensuring the public humanities continues to inspire storytelling, lifelong learning, inform public dialogue, and civic engagement. This comes from the idea that Connecticut Humanities grants out state money, and all the projects that are funded by us should be as open as possible to the public. So we have kind of three areas that we're interested in and that we're working towards. We want to promote open sharing and reuse. Working with Creative Commons is part of this, and we'll learn more about open culture shortly. We also want to make sure that the institutions we work with and the organizations and individuals get the proper credit that they deserve for their projects, either being an artist or a museum or an exhibit or a video series. We want to make sure you get credit and that you protect yourselves so that you can use your great work and make sure that it's used in ways that you want it to be used. And finally, we are working in-house on licensing our own work at Connecticut Humanities. For those of you who don't know, we have 2 projects. We have ConnecticutHistory.org, which is the state encyclopedia that has topics all about Connecticut history. And then we have Teach It, which is a lesson plan website database. And we're working on instituting and licensing our content to let people know how they can use and reuse works without contacting us every time. I do want to highlight some of the things that are coming up in our program. We are lucky enough to continue to collaborate with Creative Commons on a couple of things. There will be another webinar that we have in October with the League again. So keep an eye out for that. The topic is TBD. We have some ideas. We really want your feedback so we can really tailor that webinar to what the questions people have and really make an impactful difference with the information that we're able to provide. And then also, for those of you interested, we have a certificate training course with Creative Commons coming up in September. It is a 10-week course, and it covers everything. You're going to learn a little bit about it today, but it really goes into depth about copyright, licensing, open culture, and a whole bunch of stuff. We have some seats available, so if you're interested, I will pop my email into the chat. And feel free to reach out to me to learn more. Happy to send you information and some kind of course selections if you're interested. So today's presenter is Brigitte Vizina. We've worked with Brigitte for a while. She's fantastic, and I'm happy that we're able to bring her back. She's passionate about all things spanning culture, arts, handicraft, tradition, fashion, and of course, copyright law and policy. She gets a kick out of tackling the fuzzy legal and policy issues that stand in the way of access, use, reuse, and remix of culture, information, and knowledge. Before joining Creative Commons, she worked for a decade as a legal officer at WIPO, and then ran her own consultancy advising Europeana, Spark Europe, and others on copyright matters. Currently located in the Netherlands, where she lives with her husband and 2 kids, Brigitte grew up living in 8 different countries across North America, Africa, and Europe, but Montreal is where she proudly comes from. Brigitte is a fellow at the Canadian think tank Center for International Governance Innovation. She holds a bachelor's degree in law from the University of Montreal and a master's in law from Georgetown University. She's been a member of the Bar of Quebec since 2003, and I am happy to hand it over to her to learn all about open culture.
Thanks so much for the kind introduction, Mike. It's a pleasure to be hosting a webinar again. Hopefully some people have met already in the past sessions in the spring. Have come back for this more in-depth exploration of open culture. Also, thank you, Emily, and the League of Museums for hosting us. So I'll start sharing my screen and let's get started. All right, so as Mike said, our topic today is about kind of demystifying open access, trying to make it easy. So we'll walk through on a very superficial level, obviously, because we only have 1 hour, the few steps that you need to go through in making a decision to open your collections for greater and better sharing. And we'll particularly emphasize in the second part of the conversation the kind of factors or parameters that you might want to consider to help you make a decision on what to make open. So kind of a selection grid on how to decide what you want to make openly accessible. But before that, Creative Commons, who are we? What are we? For those of you who are not familiar, we are an international nonprofit organization. We are the ones behind the suite of open copyright licenses and public domain tools. So you may have come across the licenses in your work, but didn't know that there was an organization behind it. That happens all the time. We're a very small organization of around less than 20 people, fully distributed. And we work to try to empower people to really grow and sustain the thriving commons of shared knowledge and culture that we all need to address the world's most pressing challenges and to create a brighter future for all. What we mean by commons is the kind of huge body of knowledge and culture that is either completely free of copyright, so it's in the public domain, or it has some flexibilities, some exceptions and limitations, or some open licenses that make it easy for anyone to access, to use, and to share. And so we have programs in open climate, open education, and obviously open culture. And that's the one that I'm going to be diving into today. So our open culture program was started 3 years ago. But of course, we're building on 2 decades of organizations, so exploration of cultural heritage and the work that museums like the ones you probably work in have done in order to give greater access to their collections. And so our aim in the program is to promote better sharing of cultural heritage among collection holders. So that's often cultural heritage institutions, but it could be more informal structures like community archives is often one that doesn't really fit the cultural heritage institution box. Their users and the general public. So it's really meant to ensure that the institutions that hold collections can share it on more open, on more permissive terms with their users so that there are spillover benefits for society at large. And what we mean by better sharing is not necessarily open sharing for the sake of it. So it's not about sharing things without any copyright restrictions because that's our aim. No, we really want to promote sharing that is contextual, that is ethical, that is inclusive, that is sustainable, purposeful, and pro-social. So it's again trying to find the ways that open solutions can help fulfill a greater ambition. And so, like I said, we promote open solutions, and I'll get into what that means, to, in the case of museums, really enable institutions to realize their mission, and as an end result, to enable everyone to reconnect with cultural heritage in the digital environment. Because although we spend a lot of time online, on our phones, on our tablets, on our computers, a lot of our cultural experiences actually happen online, but when it comes to accessing cultural heritage that is held in the collections of institutions, it's a whole different story. I'm not here to tell you what a museum's mission is. You probably know this a lot better than me, but from our considerations of interacting with museums in the past few years, we've managed to synthesize this into 3 key pillars. One of them is to facilitate the public open access to collections, so making sure that the public has access and can connect with the collections, to build connections also with and among communities. So museums are seen as social spaces in addition to stewards of material collections. And it's also to enable more collective participation in creativity and knowledge creation. So not only are we caring for culture that already exists, museums can also be a space to enable new culture to be created. And so for people to be able to enjoy their fundamental rights to access cultural heritage and to take part in cultural life, and this is really a human fundamental right recognized by the United Nations, people should have the right to access cultural heritage and take part in cultural life. Museums need to be able to fulfill this mission, not only in their brick and mortar space, but also in the digital environment. And that's where things get a little trickier. So what we mean by open in this case, and I've mentioned open culture, we are maybe pivoting towards something more like open heritage when it comes to access to cultural heritage. But these are semantics at this point. The first key point is that cultural heritage collections must be available to the public online as openly as possible. And when I say open, it means free of undue copyright restrictions, and that it's accessible for use and reuse. So that means there shouldn't be any copyright barrier where it's unjustified, which would restrict normal use by any kind of user, including for commercial purposes. And use and reuse are ways to distinguish more passive use from the more creative, the one where there's adaptation and remix, and there's more involvement from the creator in interacting with the cultural heritage. So at the most fundamental level, it means that what's in the public domain, that means it's free of copyright, so copyright term has expired or it was never protected by copyright, must stay in the public domain. And this is something that we see quite often, actually, that museums will have materials in the public domain, create a digital reproduction, and then claim copyright over this digital reproduction. And this is the opposite of open. So we're saying if it's in the public domain in analog form, it should remain in the public domain in digitized form. And the last point is that access must be meaningful, inclusive, and equitable. This goes back to this concept of better sharing that I mentioned in a previous slide, where it's not access for open sake, but there is intentionality behind it. We recently published a brand new publication called Key Benefits of Open Culture, and it's based on our Open Culture Voices series that we ran for the last 2.5 years, I'd say. So Open Culture Voices are very short video interviews that we did with experts in the field coming from all over the world, where we ask them for basic questions. What are the benefits of open culture? What are the barriers of open culture? Tell us about an inspiration, something that opened your mind about open culture, and what advice you would give to someone who's hesitating to open up a collection. And so from all those interviews that we did, we managed to kind of distill what we think are the key benefits of opening up a collection. And so they are sorry about this. I don't know what just happened. just wanted to share, change slides. 1 second. I really don't know what happened. How do I get back? Oh, there you go. Okay, so. Okay, we're back. Sorry about this. So yeah, we managed to summarize what we think are the key benefits of open culture in this slide. So I won't go through all this text, but there's a longer form report, and this is just really like a very brief summary of what they are. But basically, we found out through these interviews that openness really makes cultural heritage easier to find online. It's more easily discoverable. That it can help reach broader and more diverse audiences, obviously, because it gets shared through audiences that maybe the museum doesn't have direct access to. That heritage can be preserved and safeguarded and also refined in digital form. And that heritage can be used and reused with more legal certainty, because we will see in a few moments that by using Creative Commons tools, we can very clearly indicate the copyright status of an object and also what uses are allowed and what require more permissions. And then once cultural heritage is open, it has all sorts of knock-on positive benefits for the institutions themselves. So the collection holders, they have an elevated profile, they can have more efficient organizational models. It also enhances their mission alignment. It's also very positive for research and education. It makes research more vibrant. It makes collaboration, or rather participatory education, much more possible. It increases unity among researchers for broader impact. And so there are all sorts of great benefits to opening up collections, if only for the education or research sector. It can also dynamize cultural creativity, because by making all these artworks available online, we enrich the pool of existing materials that artists and creators can get inspiration from and reuse and remix to create their own creative works. It also democratizes access and participation in cultural creativity. It makes it less of an elite activity, and makes it easier for people who would not have access.
You didn't hear me coming
to a meeting?
Yes, that I
To
was coming. I'm in a meeting.
It would just make easier for people who would not have access to an institution to just do it from wherever they are. It also increases collaboration potentials and experimentation, including of a commercial nature that could be also interesting in, you know, fostering local entrepreneurship. And then we also see that it has benefits for society in general. It makes for more just, democratic, diverse, free, and equitable societies, because it can help foster intercultural connections that would otherwise not be possible. It can lead to greater diversity, equity, and inclusion, and social justice. And also, I think very importantly, it can enhance access to more reliable, more trustworthy information. And this is critical in a time where misinformation and disinformation are rife. And of course, many more. This is what we were able to gather from the interviews, but we can also imagine a lot of other benefits that opening up collections can trigger. And so there's only one way to find out. It's by opening up collections yourself. The Getty Museum just did so a few months ago. In March, they released a press release saying that they had just released more than 88,000 images of artworks with CC0, which is our public domain dedication tool. And they've seen, I think, if I'm not mistaken, downloads of images go up to 30,000 per month after they've opened them up. They made them freely accessible without any copyright restriction. So they're already seeing really concrete positive impact in their visibility and their the use of this collection. This is a map visualization of the Open GLAM survey, which is a survey that tries to catalog all the institutions that have open access policies throughout the world. And as you can see, they are highly concentrated in the Western Hemisphere. Europe, USA are where most institutions have already gone open. And at Creative Commons, one of our aims is to really make the whole map red, maybe, to make sure that there are institutions in all corners of the world that practice open access in order to derive benefits from for themselves, but also for their communities. So at a glance, these are the Creative Commons open licenses and the public domain tools. In other webinars, I've gone through all of them in more detail. No, it's not our goal in this session to go into each and every one of them and explain what they do, but I wanted to give you an overview so that when I say Creative Commons licenses, you have some visual, and maybe now that you see these, you're like, ah, yeah, that's what she's been talking about. So the top ones are the licenses, and they can be used by creators who want to share their own creations on more permissive terms than what the copyright default would allow. So if you're a creator, you're a musician, you're an illustrator, you're a painter, you're a sculptor, or even like if you're working and you write reports and blog posts and you take photographs for your website, these are all considered creators under copyright. The copyright law gives you an exclusive right to do all sorts of things with your own creation. So you have a monopoly of exploiting your creation. So you can decide who can reproduce it, who can adapt it, who can communicate it to the public. There's all sorts of rights that you exclusively own. That means that nobody else is allowed to do any uses of your work without your permission. Of course, there's exceptions and limitations, and in the US, there's this broad concept of fair use. So there are things that other people can do without permission. But, that remains an exception and not the rule. And what Creative Commons does is that it kind of lifts a lot of these restrictions. So for a lot of uses that are very common, there is no need to ask for permission. The only requirement that's in all of the licenses is that the creator is acknowledged. So you see the by icon. So you have to attribute the work to its creator, but otherwise most of the uses are free and don't require permission. At the bottom of the screen, you see the public domain tools. So these are a little bit different because they have absolutely no restriction, not even the need to attribute the author or creator. On the left side, so it's like a zero sign. It's called CC0 or public domain dedication. That can be used on something that is currently under copyright, but where the creator decides to waive, to renounce all their rights. And so they put the work immediately in the public domain. There are absolutely no copyright restrictions anymore. And on the right-hand side, it's a C with a diagonal bar through it. And that is the public domain mark. And that is not a license. That is more like a label. It's more like an indication by someone who is not necessarily the copyright holder because the rights have expired, but that something is in the public domain to the best of their knowledge. So that can be used on very, very old works where there's no doubt that the object is in the public domain, but it gives very clear information to anyone wanting to use it that it is in the public domain. So it helps in communicating this public domain status for enhanced legal certainty. So that was a very quick overview, but you can see that licenses can use CC licenses and tools on a variety of content. So we advise that metadata be released with CC0 so that any metadata that is generated in the digitization process is made freely accessible for anyone to reuse and replicate and reproduce. On digital reproductions of public domain works. So, for example, this map, obviously very old, most probably in the public domain. The institution, when digitizing and creating this digital reproduction, could decide to either use CC0 to make it absolutely clear that they're not claiming any copyrights if they exist anywhere in the world, or a public domain mark. So that anyone wanting to use this image would have reassurance that it is indeed in the public domain and doesn't need to ask for permission. When it comes to materials that are created by museums, by employees, or by contractors, so things that are being created at the moment, they will probably be protected by copyright. And for those kinds of materials, the open reflex here would be to share them CC0, so without any copyright restrictions, or by CC BY, which is the least restrictive of the licenses, only requires attribution, so that the materials can be shared and reused and translated and used in different contexts more widely. And that can really help spread knowledge about the collections. So this is the part of the presentation where I can pause and see if there are any questions before we move on to the second part. So are there any questions? I can't see anyone raising their hands or putting questions in the chat.
I don't see any. Somebody in the chat has shared the chooser, which is great. And then someone asked, why would any organization be against this? Which, like, yes, thank you. This is the goal. I want everyone to have that question. Emily, do you see any other hands or anything? I think we're
I don't see anything else. I didn't get anything privately messaged either. So I think we're good. But there will be another opportunity at the end as well.
Mm-hmm. But I can take this question because it's actually a very valid question, because there are many organizations that are maybe consciously or not even consciously against this. And so remember the Open Culture Voices interviews that I mentioned, I asked what would be the barriers to opening up. And so a lot of institutions are actually hesitant to go open for a variety of reasons. And we published something called the Barriers to Open Culture, and they mostly fall into three main categories: people, money, and policy. So when it comes to people, sometimes they just lack the skills or the resources. The people are not well trained to be able to digitize and maintain an online collection. So they just don't have the right people in place, or the people just don't have access to this kind of training and just aren't able to do it. The flip side of this is that sometimes they might have the resources, but they are very risk averse and have a very conservative mindset and feel like they own the collection and are the gatekeepers to the collection, and so are very afraid of putting it out there and, you know, God forbid something bad happens. They're afraid of sometimes collections being misused or misrepresented, or being used in situations or in contexts that don't really align with their values. And that has happened. But the risk of that happening is so small compared to all the benefits that can be generated from making it available, that we often say that it's not really a valid justification to make it completely closed. In terms of the money issue, it's also very expensive to open up, like to digitize, to open up, to maintain a website, to maintain all the infrastructure behind it. So often it's a cost issue that institutions are just not able to bear. And again, there's a flip side to this money issue, is that a lot of institutions want to derive revenue from licensing their images. So instead of making them freely accessible, they will put them behind a paywall through a very convoluted application or request process where scholars or students or anyone who wants to use an image will have to go through a complicated process to obtain permission to use the image, and will often have to pay a fee, which is unjustified with regard to, you know, the use that is being asked for. So it's sometimes hard to understand also the calculations that these institutions make. Like the cost benefit analysis is often really not in favor of charging licensing fees. Many researchers have shown that it's actually not profitable. You might derive a small revenue, but the whole apparatus behind granting these licenses is so cumbersome that people running that process would actually be better off doing something more useful, more productive for the organization. Why the third category is policy, is the fact that copyright law can be a barrier. It can really stand in the way of making things more open. There will often be some kind of resistance to doing a thorough rights clearance just because it's so complicated. And so that really is a huge roadblock in making collections open. And then finally, there's no positive law that says, yes, all institutions should make their collections open. It's mandated, and then makes it very clear that museums and other cultural heritage institutions should do that, and that they have the support of, you know, public funding and a public umbrella structure that kind of protects their rights in this. There is no such thing at the moment. So there's a lot of legal insecurity and a lot of, I guess, hesitance because of that. So thank you for the question. Are there any others before we move on? No. Okay. All right. So how do we decide what to make open? And that's going to be the second part of this presentation. By the way, there is currently a working group of the Open Culture platform that is developing a set of guidelines on how to decide what to make open. So I'm a bit, I guess, prejudging what this working group is going to come up with, but at least it gives you a flavor of the kinds of questions that you can consider. But before we get to the what, a more important question is who, because maybe as an institution, you will be tempted to kind of go through the decision process yourself. You know your collection, you kind of have already an idea of what you want to make openly accessible. But it's really important to engage with your stakeholders, with your audience, with people in your communities and your environment. It's also equally important to build strong relationships and to collaborate with the communities and the individuals that you serve, because that will really encourage a plurality of perspectives, of different meanings, and bring all these different knowledges together for a more informed decision. So there might be a temptation to, you know, do it fast and not involve too many people because things will get decided more easily, but it's actually very important that this is done taking into account all the different perspectives of who you will be serving with this open collection. This is a screenshot of a presentation that I thought was really illuminating on this question. It's by Simon Tanner, who is a very well-known professor who has been working on open access to cultural heritage for decades now. And he had this slide that I thought I could also share with you, because it really shows how the ideal world sometimes clashes with the real world. So ideally, you would start your selection process based on your values, your audience, your information goals, that is built with the communities, which is what I just alluded to. And that would then trickle into identifying the collections of value to the goals. So you match the items that you want to make open based on all those considerations at the beginning, and then you plan the most effective route to create the resource, and then you seek funding for ideas. In the real world, it's often the other way around, and so a lot of the decisions will be constrained or dictated by some of the funding or the financial resources available. But nevertheless, I just thought it will be nice to look at what might be some of the factors that will influence your decision, but that is with a very pregnant awareness that funding can sometimes be a real issue that is kind of taking over all the other nice considerations. So the advice that we hear again and again over and over is to start small, but to start. It can be overwhelming to think about, the Getty's 88,000 images, but I'm sure that their conversations didn't start with 88,000. So the idea is to really think about where is a good starting point? Where does the institution feel is a good place to look into what could be made openly accessible, but to just give it a try, not get stuck by the magnitude or the scale of the project, but start so that you can experiment and be flexible along the way. I wanted to share a very short video of one of our interviewees for the Open Culture Voices, George Oates, who's the executive director at the Flickr Foundation. Hopefully you can hear what she has to say, and if the sound doesn't work, just give me a shout. Can you hear?
No, we can't.
Oh, that's too bad. I kind of remembered that this was an issue. What if I add the subtitles? At least you can read the subtitles. All right, so that was George Oates talking about how sometimes you can just start with things that are clearly out of copyright, and that gets rid of a huge headache further down the line. So that brings me to kind of the first dimension I thought that we could talk about, which is to start with collections or items in the collections that are in the public domain. There's already no copyright restrictions, so it makes it much easier to make it openly accessible because it is already by default open. Of course, it's the determination of whether an item is in the public domain or still protected by copyright that is very tricky. And so for that, we advise to really familiarize yourself with the basics of copyright law to understand, when does copyright protection start, when does it end, all the exceptions to this to the sometimes deceivingly straightforward rule, and to really start making the determination of the copyright status of all the works that you want to make available at the very beginning. It should be part of the typical workflow to really make sure that you know exactly what is the copyright status of every item that you want to make available, and that you document your decision and all the clearance process if you had to clear rights, so that you have gone through your due diligence. And once you've gone through that and you can identify things that are clearly in the public domain, that is surely a safer and easier place to start from. There are many such flowcharts out there on the internet. They are very useful to get a very, a sketch of what might be protected or not. It's always great and better to have someone with legal expertise, copyright law expertise to help make those determinations. But if you don't have those resources, there are a lot of tools online that you can resort to in order to make those determinations. This is from the Stanford fair use website that has many more of these resources, and I really encourage you to look into them. It can be a bit daunting when you see all these arrows, but once you have information about your artwork, you can easily navigate it, and then it will lead you to either green, public domain, or red in copyright, or you need to be a bit more careful that you might need to ask for permission to make things openly accessible. This is also a kind of summary of what the key questions are. They've been written by Anne Young, who led open access process at her institution. And it's really quite helpful to really determine what are the key questions so that you don't get bogged down in all the details. But if you can answer these questions in a straightforward manner, you're on the right path. So the first question is, when was the work published? Was it 300 years ago? Was it 50 years ago? Was it last year? That already gives you an idea of whether it's in copyright or not. And I should say that copyright starts at the creation of the work and ends in general 70 years after the death of the creator. So it can be in copyright for a very long time, and often the death of the author is the kind of date that you should look at to determine whether it's in copyright or not. Who made the work? So you need to know who the creator is. For anonymous works or works that are released under a pseudonym, it can be a little trickier. But usually knowing who the author is with the date of birth and death can be a good starting point. If the work was created by more than a single author, you also need to look at who is the last surviving, or when is the last date of death of the author, because that will show you how long it is still in copyright. Like I said, when did the author die? In the US and most countries in the world, it's the life of the author plus 70 years. And of course, there are many exceptions. Sometimes you can fall under a copyright limitation or exception, like fair use. So even though it is in copyright, you might have the right as an institution to publish it. But there again, I think legal advice is warranted. Another way to look at it is once you've determined the copyright status, is to consider your very own crown jewels. So what at your institution would you consider is like your Mona Lisa, or your Van Gogh sunflower? What is the emblematic work that really represents who you are? What do your visitors come to see? What best represents the museum's identity or even the values? What works will draw attention to the rest of the collection or the entire collection? Like, what would be the flagship work that will entice people to come and discover more? And also, like, what is relevant? What is significant? What is a key part of the story that you want to tell? So that can be a very useful lens to start small. If you want to start with maybe just a couple, it can be less than 10, but the things that you are kind of famous for could be the things that you decide to share openly. And that could be a bit counterintuitive, because you'd be like, oh, well, I don't want that to be all over the internet, but it's actually your best business card online and the way to draw more visitors to your physical location. Another way to select materials is materials that you would digitize for preservation purposes anyway. So material that is at risk of degradation or loss that you need to make a preservation copy of. Why not, by the same token, just make it openly accessible so that before it gets lost, more researchers or even any members of the public can have access to it and help maintain it and keep it alive, and maybe even pass it on to the next generation in this digital form. We also need to pay attention to culturally sensitive materials. So I said at the beginning that we promote better sharing. That means that not necessarily everything should be made openly accessible without any kind of restrictions. We know that there are, for example, funeral objects or human remains or objects that have a spiritual or a sacred significance for Indigenous people. They will have to abide by a different set of rules of what can be accessed and under which conditions. So it's very important to be mindful of different kinds of rules and protocols that might dictate what can be made, what can be used and under which condition. And so here the lesson is that the copyright status of an object, or whether it's in the public domain already, is not the only consideration, that there might be additional rules that we need to abide by to make sure that when it comes to culturally sensitive materials, we do this in a respectful and ethical way. I would like to refer you to the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance that do ensure that. So it's a set of principles that you can follow to make sure that you take account of the historical context and some power imbalances that are associated with the materials in the collections. On the right-hand side, there's a selection of the traditional knowledge labels that are stewarded by an organization called Local Contexts. And they follow the Creative Commons model in the sense that they have standardized labels that can be used across the world to identify what would be the use restrictions or permissions with regard to Indigenous knowledge and culture. And so they could be used alongside Creative Commons licenses or tools, but they cater to different needs and they give different kinds of information about the content that is being shared. So that's also a nice way to kind of I'm sorry about this. I don't know why. It just crashes.
I think I can, are we back? Because I can fill some time. Someone had a question, but we can wait till the end if you're ready to go.
Yeah, I really don't know what happened. I don't do anything. It just disappears. And it's the first time this happens. But yeah, moving along, for example, the Smithsonian Institution in Washington released, I think it was over 2 million items about 4 years ago. And they also have an open values statement that addresses these issues around culturally sensitive materials. And they have standard language that says that they respect the rights of the communities. And so one way to address these issues, especially when there's uncertainties, is to have some kind of notice and takedown process that you might want to make content available, but make sure that there's a process for anyone who might object to this being made openly accessible, that they can contact, and there can be a conversation about what to do, whether it should stay online or not. Another way to look at this is just to open on demand. So you might be getting these requests if your collection is not yet open. So you might be dealing with scholars who want to use content for their PhD thesis, for example, or for their book, or students who want to use images for a school project, artists that want to include this in their creative practice, local entrepreneurs that might want to, use some of the flavor of the local museum in order to incorporate this in their business strategies. Anyways, you might get a lot of requests to use digital images. And so that could be a really nice way to determine what actually people are interested in. And so based on these individual requests, anything that is digitized and shared with the individual could be then part of the general open access collection. So any new digital images as they are being requested on an individual basis could be added to the open collection to grow the collection online bit by bit and based on demand. Another key point would be to aim for accessibility. There are, of course, really useful technological solutions to make sure that the content is made accessible for people who have disabilities. The very obvious one is, to use alt text for images so that you have some alternative language description of what an image might be, and that will also increase equity in access to knowledge. And this is my last slide, encouraging you to, plant the seeds of open and see what grows, to maybe adopt a long-term view, to see this as, building a legacy for the museum beyond its physical space, but really venturing into the digital space where so much is happening in our cultural life generally, and be flexible. Be open to change course or to, veer and change directions if things don't go as planned. I've heard from someone that, they did it and the sky didn't fall. So maybe if we just aim for that, it should all go well. So that's it for my presentation, and I really look forward to any questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Brigitte. There's a couple questions here. I do want to say, and kind of dovetail really well into like plant a seed and see what grows. Connecticut Humanities wants to help you do that if you're interested in this. If you're interested in learning more about going open, or you're starting it, or you don't know where to start, or it's like, how do we get, like, Connecticut Humanities is here to help with that. So that's perfect. We got a couple questions. One is from Avianca from the Temple Beth Israel Preservation Society, asking about what platform do you particularly like. I'm assuming for exhibits, Avianca, because
yes, for exhibits. So for example, we're not a museum, but we are working on a community archive. So sort of a memory project. And I'm a complete novice when it comes to curating and anything related to museums, but I've been quickly educating myself. So we currently use Omeka S, and it's not the most, how do I say this politely? I mean, it's for a complete novice like me. I found it very difficult. I'm getting better. But I was just wondering if there was something that's a little easier, maybe a little bit more intuitive, or if that's the standard, then I'll just zip it.
Right. I think maybe this is a bigger discussion beyond rights about like digital systems and things like that, and you're in the right place, because we do, Connecticut Humanities works with the Connecticut League of Museums on their digital projects and the University of Connecticut on their digital projects. What I would say, this kind of gets me to a point I want to mention here, is like when Brigitte's talking about licenses, and there's something called right statements, which sit aside next to licenses but are different. When working with the system, we want to make sure that you have the ability to apply a license or rights to it that are consistent, right? So we're working with our digital systems in the state so that when you make a determination and you get into Connecticut collections or the Connecticut Digital Archive or even Omeka S, the licenses are there in a kind of predictable way so we can share information. So I'm happy to circle back with you offline. I'm not going to talk about systems in Omeka S because we also have an Omeka S instance that we're playing around with. So
Great, thank you.
I have a question from Michelle. She wants to know, do you know of a good resource that addresses use in derivative works in the United States besides the copyright.gov website? And Michelle, if you're still here, if you want to unmute, maybe to elaborate.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear everything that you said at the end.
Oh, I was going to say, if you wanted to come off mute to elaborate on the question about derivative works and see if we can help you out.
I'm just curious. You did mention early in your presentation, Brigitte, that there was some issue with derivative works and people and museums holding on to different types of derivative works that they've made and holding the copyright on those. And, what the legal ramifications are, because, when you make a derivative work, you're really copyrighting the entire work. You're not really copyrighting each individual item within the work, right? So
yeah, go on.
no, I'm trying to sort some of that out in my head. I've been involved in projects that are derivative projects, and they seem to be fine. One of the good things is that we don't really charge for them. So, there's not that level of complexity. And I think that makes quite a bit of a difference in terms of when a derivative work is used to really inform and educate and not make money as their primary reason for existence. Right. So I'm just wondering if there is some type of an organization similar to maybe Creative Commons that really addresses derivative works and what the meaning of that is. And because this can get very deep and you can really get stuck in the muck and mire of all the little details of, well, is it really derivative work? And what does derivative work mean? And, and the copyright.gov website does outline it, but there's always questions.
All right. Well, there's many layers to your question. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Just going back to what I said, I wasn't necessarily referring to derivative works, but we can talk about derivative works. But I was talking about any materials that you might create, posters or catalogs or even content on your website. So if the institution is the one creating the content, the institution will hold copyright, and so they can make decisions on whether to release it under a Creative Commons license or not. So it's different from the materials that are in the collections, where often the institution is not the copyright holder. Now, concerning derivative works, it's also a very interesting question. Derivative works has a very specific meaning in copyright, and we can think of it as an adaptation of an existing work. So if you take a work that is in copyright and you adapt it, so it could mean that you translate it, it could mean that you take a book and you turn it into a movie, or it could also mean that you take an image, a photograph, and you modify it a little bit. These are all kinds of derivative works. And in order to do that as a user, you need the permission of the copyright holder. So you cannot make adaptations unless you have permission from the copyright holder, unless it's released under a Creative Commons license that allows adaptation. And there is one type of license that does not allow derivative works. It's called NDs, for no derivatives. And so if you come across an item that is licensed under a CC by ND license, you are not able to make derivative works on that basis, unless an exception applies. So if you're doing it for educational purposes and you fit within the conditions of fair use, you don't need to respect the terms of the license, because the exception, so fair use, will always come and override the terms of the license. I'll try to share a webpage that we have that explains what an adaptation is in the context of the license. I think that would be quite helpful.
Great, thank you. Yes, I was very aware of the fair use and educational use part of that. And I appreciate you reminding me of that, because it was something that when I asked the question, I was not thinking of. So, there's just so many different layers in doing something like this, whether, no matter which end you're on, whether you're in a museum setting and you're trying to help someone that is trying to do derivative work, or if you're the person doing the derivative work and trying to get that information and use it.
Great. Thank you. I don't see any other questions. I answered one in the chat. Someone asked about the recommendation to help accessibility. And I believe Brigitte was talking about alt text. And I found a website on Harvard about it that I can share in the email afterwards about how to do alt texts. Brigitte, thank you so much again. It was a pleasure to have you back. I'm looking forward to working with you again in October. And we will send out links to slides, web pages we talked about. Thank you to the League. Thank you to Emily for putting this together. Always good to work with you. Again, please reach out, Connecticut Humanities. If you type Connecticut Humanities IP or intellectual property, you'll find our page. We'll include it in the email. And yes, Brigitte, they're asking for if we can share your email. I think maybe we can do that as contact too. Again, any digital questions, any open access questions, feel free to contact Connecticut Humanities. The Digital Humanities Department will be launching a new webpage soon with some contact info. We want to learn about your projects. We want to connect you to Creative Commons and Brigitte and connect you to the systems that allow you to share openly. And always happy to talk more to anybody. If that's it, Emily, thank you again. Brigitte, thank you. It was really good to see everybody. Stay cool. Yeah.
Thank you so much,
Thank you
Mike.
so much.